this computer. And I think I am recording now.
Yes.
Button's telling me. Okay, great. Okay, so large group, we'll start with large group, context and history. What can we learn about taking stands in our faith? So Faith, I don't know if you want to, I know we want to talk a little bit about transubstantiation and consubstantiation, which I did define them on the agenda. But before that, I thought we might want to talk about the Babylonian captivity of the church.
Yes.
Any other context you want to throw in there, or maybe if anybody has a question specifically, but what was the Babylonian captivity of the church? Why would this prove to be the fatal blow in Luther's growing war with Rome?
Well, I think that the important image is to know what is meant by the Babylonian captivity. That is drawn both from Old Testament, when the Jews were taken into exile in Babylon, and so were in captive. And then it's also from the book of Revelation. Remember when we studied the book of Revelation, the whore of Babylon?
Mm-hmm.
In which that was used as a symbol of sin, was a symbol of all that was against what God was trying to do. And so I think to talk about the Babylonian, when Luther talks about the Babylonian captivity of the church, he's got both those images in mind. That it's basically a way of saying the church is not what it's supposed to be. It is being held captive, and then you can fill in what it's being held captive by.
I love this. And here is the definition. This just came out of the Leader Guide, written in Latin in 1520 by Martin Luther. This theological treatise examines the sacraments of the Catholic Church and compared the current state of the church to Israel's exile in Babylon. Luther denies that there are 7 sacraments. So I guess there are 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, which I did not know.
Yes, there are.
Marriage, confirmation, ordination. I don't even know what is extreme.
Okay. So you all know what marriage is. You all know what confirmation is. Yes. You know what ordination is. Those are all sacraments in the church. Extreme unction is what we call final healing, or what used to be called at the point of death, you called in the priest to say the prayer and give you the healing. That's extreme unction. And oddly enough, even in the United Methodist Church, we have prayers for healing that can be used at the point of death. I do that a lot when someone is in the hospital or has acknowledged that this is the end. We do an anointing and the healing. We don't consider it a sacrament. Penance is confession,
right,
or repentance, while we only have the 2,
which is baptism and the Lord's Supper.
Right, and that's where we share in common with most Protestant churches. Remember that the sacraments were a way of power and control for the Roman Catholic Church at that time. Because if you couldn't have the sacraments, you were pretty much excluded from heaven.
So the sacraments were, okay, somebody's coming in, hold on. Oh, Shannon's coming in, okay. So the sacraments were a way that the church had control over the people. But it's so, like, well, I don't understand, like, this is, and maybe somebody else has a question, feel free to, since I can't see everybody, I just think it's interesting, like, we have confirmation, we have marriage, we have ordination. You just gave an idea of how we have this. We have confession, so why are they, I don't understand why, for some reason, he was like, okay, baptism and the supper are sacraments. Do you,
Dana?
Yeah.
Can I answer you?
Sure.
They were both told, the ones that the Protestants consider sacraments are initiated specifically by Jesus.
Yeah, Michelle is absolutely correct. Those are the ones that are named, which is really interesting because the other sacrament that Jesus specifically commanded us to do, we don't do, and we don't call a sacrament.
Which is?
Foot washing.
foot washing. I know, I love that. We had this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, he
Yeah.
modeled that and did that, but
It's funny, foot washing isn't mentioned then or now.
no.
All right, people, that's going to be
But-
it. That's our
But
stand. We're
Michelle
going to
is
start foot
correct.
washing.
He considered those two because they were, and then raged one of the larger debates. Well, it's actually still being raged. Is whether we should have infant baptism or believers' baptism. And the church is still divided on that. And we are still divided among the churches on how we view the sacrament of Holy Communion.
So let's talk about that, because this is where transubstantiation and consubstantiation we can start there. So let's talk about.
Anybody have any questions about that? Did you all get what was being said there?
Here, I'll stop sharing. Who's got, Michelle, go ahead. You have your hand up.
I would like to know how the Methodist Church does it, because I know they consider it symbolic, but when I was being quote unquote confirmed as an adult, it wasn't a Lutheran church. So I got the Lutheran version. And I've always kind of felt that the Methodists took communion kind of, well, should I say lightly?
Oh, poor
Not
thing.
this Methodist. Not this Methodist.
So
Let's see if anybody else has some before we.
What else? What are other observations on anybody?
Anybody know what the United Methodist Church? Do we believe in transubstantiation?
no.
Good. We don't. The substance does not change.
June, do you have something?
Well, I was going to ask about infant baptism versus believer baptism, but that's changing the subject. So
Hold that and we'll go back to it because it really is important. Okay? Let's not forget that question. When I first became gluten-free and wasn't doing the bread, I was trying to find sources of gluten-free that you could use, in place of, and got into, now granted, this was about 10 years ago, and got into one of these really interesting debates online, was reading them, mostly driven by Roman Catholic understanding, as to why you couldn't have gluten-free for the bread, because the bread had to be actually bread with the wheat in it or it couldn't change. So this is what happens when we start getting literally, they were very serious about this.
Meaning that not like.
If it didn't have gluten in it, it wasn't real bread, therefore it couldn't be used for communion.
Fascinating.
But see, it's a whole different concept because the elements are actually changing their substance. That's what transubstantiation means. The substance of the bread and the wine changes into the body and blood.
why was that so important?
Because it actually then became the real presence of Jesus Christ. You actually consumed his body.
You're like literally eating Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Taking Jesus into you.
Cannibalistic, but I'm just going to say uncomfortable.
That was one of the accusations against the early church, that they were cannibals.
I was uncomfortable with communion for years for that very reason. I, looked at it and said, this is crazy.
Now,
wait, Donna has her hand
consubstantiation.
up. Wait, hold on. Donna has her hand up. Go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, my son David and his family have gone to the Catholic Church because that's where she was raised, in the Catholic Church. And only recently have they, at least the church they go to in Alexandria, Virginia, have they been very adamant on their bulletins that if you're not baptized Catholic, you can't take communion.
That's correct.
Which I resent terribly. So I go to communion because to me, it's communication with God, not the priest, not the Pope, nothing. I go
At their church, you go.
at their church.
Mm.
I don't look at it the same way as wearing masks or not wearing a mask. But this is my feeling about communion. I once went to a chaplain's conference and spouse, and one of the subjects we talked about was, if you could only have one, would you take communion or preaching? And the group was split right down the line, but I chose communion. Sorry, Faith.
All right, so let's talk. So Faith, talk to us a little. Tell us how this transition all happened.
Well, the Lutherans looked at it, as it's in your book, page 71, consubstantiation, which means that Christ is really there, but it doesn't change any of the properties of the elements. They're still bread, they're still wine, they don't change. But somehow Christ is truly present in those elements. Now, I've coined a word to explain how United Methodists do it, because I think that to talk about it simply as symbolic loses the power and the mystery of it. If you just say, well, it's just a symbol, and then what we're seeing today, pardon me, is that you can just use anything because they're just symbols. It doesn't matter anything. So the word that I use, which you won't find in books, but is transsignification. That the significance of the elements changes in the act of Holy Communion so that they take on a new understanding and a new meaning for us. And we also believe, like the Lutherans, that Christ is truly present at the table. That when we take communion, Christ is present at the table. That's one of the reasons why you can't just do whatever you want with communion and go willy-nilly with the ritual.
So did I spell it right? Transsignification?
Transsignification.
So there is a transformation.
But that's mine.
Significant. It's
Yes.
yeah, it's coined by Faith. It's not, in the
So don't,
Wait, maybe I should Google it and find out what comes up. But I like it because it's a transition, but it's significant. It
changes the significance of the elements.
Okay. Is that what you teach? Do you teach that word?
Yes, that's what I teach my students.
But you also agree with Luther that that God is present in Holy Communion.
Absolutely.
Because when I talked to Pastor John about it, I was kind of like, wait a second here.
That would have been an interesting conversation, Michelle, because I would be very surprised if John Shaver does not believe in the real presence of Christ in the communion.
All right, let's ask him. No, don't.
Well, maybe
I'll ask him,
I said
but
that. Don't do it.
That would surprise me.
I don't want to get some email.
So you're saying that's why the elements aren't just a symbol?
They're more than just this. It's a fine line, June, because symbols are powerful.
Yeah.
For instance, let me get controversial.
Confederate statues.
And flags.
Yeah.
One of the things that stands out in my mind, and I wrote my whole dissertation on symbolism, so, but I went to see a production of Stephen Sondheim's The Assassins. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. Kathy's nodding. Yeah. It's a play about all the presidential would-be assassins and the real assassins. and they're having this conversation with why can't I think, the one who killed Kennedy, and trying to convince him that he's supposed to do it. Okay, and the play is not shown very often. Okay, but in the beginning, where I saw it in Los Angeles, when you walk into the entranceway and you go to take your seat, it was just a small theater, about 40 of us or so. There's an American flag laying on the floor. And as you walk in, you have to decide whether you're going to step on the flag and go to your seat or walk around it to do that. And it's just fascinating because the power, that's a symbol.
Okay, and here's where I have a question, because it just came to me, is what is the difference between a symbol and an idol? So, because what I'm trying to wrestle with is some of these things have become, in my personal opinion, idolatry.
That's the question of the day. You can't, there isn't a definition of, the symbol is supposed to point to something beyond itself. And it's the truth beyond that counts. The idol, we tend to worship and focus on itself.
So the symbol, okay, go ahead, Stephanie, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, 'cause that's what I was thinking as well, is that the symbol, it's what the symbol invokes in us
Yes.
that is significant. Like same thing with communion. It's the ritual, the whole ritual of communion. The bread and the wine are a symbol, are a part of that ritual, but it's what, that presence of Christ is invoked in us and around us through that ritual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a fascinating discussion. But then then you can't worship false idols, I guess, or there's, or in Islam, there's no symbols. Is that true?
There's no symbol for God.
Yeah.
There's no symbol for God in Judaism.
And you shouldn't worship the symbols. The symbols are significant and meaningful, but they themselves shouldn't be worshiped. That would be idolatry.
Yeah,
correct?
that's fascinating.
And symbols change. I mean, if I were to show you a picture of the swastika, right?
You'd have a negative reaction, but it came from somewhere else, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah, it was
Actually,
an early Christian symbol.
Well, no, it's also in Hindu, it is a symbol, because I remember when we went to India and people had the swastika on their car and we're like, what the heck is this? And our friend's like, oh, no, this is a symbol of like, I forget what I can't remember, but it is not, they do not see it as what we see it as.
Yeah. So it's, yeah.
I'm not sure we solved any problems there, but
Well, we did some clarification.
we did some clarification.
And just, June, to touch on what you asked, infant baptism, which is what the United Methodist practice, as opposed to, say, the Baptist believers' baptism. Believers' baptism says you have to understand what you're doing, and you have to understand enough to know, and you have to believe and confess. Infant baptism puts the emphasis on the fact that the sacrament is a gift of God's grace, not dependent on who we are, our abilities or lack of them, or our understanding. So that every time we baptize an infant, we are reminded that none of us can earn our relationship to God. It is a gift.
But don't you have a slightly different view of it, Faith? Because you think baptism is an incredibly important sacrament, and that there is a call to action. Yeah. So
I believe that baptism defines us, identifies us, and forever shapes our way of life in the world. Because it is out of the identity of who we are we treat others. And so I think that pastors should be preaching on baptism at least once a month.
And is it to remind people what baptism
Remind.
is, why it's significant, how it is your identity? Yeah, got it. Mhm.
Well, what we forget is that baptism has an ethical dimension. It is not simply a theological or even a spiritual aspect. It has an ethical dimension. It
And-
determines how you live in the world.
I was gonna say, what do you mean by ethical dimension?
That means that if I see myself as a child of God and I see you as a child of God, that puts a certain accountability on me as to how I treat you in every dimension of life. My baptism affects how I vote.
And
Don't
Right,
get me
right.
started on baptism. You'll never stop me.
Willeen, go ahead. I think you have to go ahead.
Well, what you said, Faith, I like that, but what if the parents never follow through with their commitment? And it is, the baptism itself is sort of just symbolic to that family, and it doesn't.
Except my answer to that, William, would be this on two counts. One, it's an act of God's grace. And who knows what God's going to do in the life of that child. That's why I don't refuse to give baptism to someone whose parents have no idea what's going on. The other is that the church is accountable also. You know, every time you participate in a baptism, I remind you that you make a promise. And most churches have failed that promise. The congregation says in baptism that it will help nurture that child, that it will be an example, which means it will also have Sunday school for that child and Sunday school teachers, because you promised to raise the child in the Christian faith.
We're flawed humans.
Huh?
I said we're flawed humans.
But I mean, it's not just the parental responsibility. The congregation makes a promise.
Right. So Barbara, and then Ruth has a comment. So Barbara, go ahead.
Well, I don't get it. I mean, if let's say it depends totally on the parents if the child gets baptized or not. That's the first thing. So are you saying you treat the poor little kid different if it was baptized or not? I mean, this is all kind of wild to me here.
No, I don't think she's saying
Never
that. Go
treat a
ahead.
child. Every child is a child of God,
Right.
baptized or not.
Exactly.
Right.
The question, Barbara, was what's the difference between baptizing a child versus waiting
Yeah, I
and having
understand that part.
Yeah.
And my take on this is, I mean, you can do either or both. I mean, both. But
No,
both
you can't do both. Not in the Methodist Church.
Yeah, once you're baptized, you're baptized. You can't re-baptize yourself.
Well, I mean, that just shows that probably for people who do that, they show that they are they just reiterate their faith, kind of, I think.
We reaffirm baptism, but we never re-baptize.
Right,
Come on,
I mean, that's
Michelle.
confirmation, right?
Absolutely. In fact, Barbara, the reason we have confirmation is because we baptize as infants,
Right,
and infant makes no promise.
exactly.
And so at some point in time, they have to say, what my parents did on my behalf, I now claim for myself.
Okay, so let me go because I've got a couple more comments. So Ruth asked, so how does it have an ethical dimension if we can't earn God's love? Don't ethics describe what we do?
Yes.
And I think she's talking about,
It's our response.
there's your answer, Ruth, yes.
It's our response.
And June wrote, maybe it has an ethical dimension because our recognition of grace should inspire us to act
Yes.
in ethical ways in gratitude for the earned grace we have received, for the unearned grace we have received. Yes, June.
That is absolutely. That is absolutely the case.
Oh, and then so what if the church promises to nurture the child? What happens if the child turns out gay? Well,
Well,
first off, you can't.
there's nothing about being gay in baptism.
Okay, and now wait, Michelle and Donna both had their hands up. So Michelle, go ahead, then Donna, and then we're gonna regroup ourselves here. Go, Michelle.
Okay, ironically, the person who brought me to Christ as a college student, so we're talking adult here, was baptized as a child. And I guess she didn't remember her baptism, and she was upset that she didn't have a symbol or whatever. So she was rebaptized. And I was really puzzled by this. What would you, and she was a very conservative, fundamentalist kind of Christian, and she did this.
I can't account for what other pastors do. I can only say what we teach.
Well, it goes back to, I mean, I think the simplest thing is if baptism is God's gift to us, it's undeserved. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be baptized more than once. It's just once.
Right.
You just get it.
God never lies.
Right. It just is what it
When
is.
God says, I love you, you're mine, you're a child of God, you may screw it up, but God doesn't.
Right. And you may, when you decide you have to be rebaptized, that's a you problem, not a God problem.
Actually, I think what people are really looking for, and here I am willing to work with people on this. I think what they're looking for is a sense of assurance. They want a reaffirmation of the reality of who they are.
Got it.
And the church provides that.
Yeah.
We provide it in the sacrament of reaffirmation of baptism.
Okay. Donna, go ahead. No, I want to get to Donna and then I'm going to stop because we have other questions. Go ahead.
Y'all figured it out what I was going to say, so forget.
Okay. All right. Just so it's 10:34 and I really want to get a little bit into, because you're right, we could have a whole study on, clearly we need to also have a study on the sacraments.
You think sacraments are dull, but they're not.
Yeah. So we need to have a study on the sacraments. That's clear to me. I've got that in my parking lot notes. So we need we need biblical, how the Bible was formed, and a study on sacraments.
Yeah, but we're talking about the first one.
So I just have one question again.
No, Barbara, wait, but I want to just hold your question. Type it in the chat for me so that we can keep going. Type it in the chat. Okay, so Rob Furcoy, here's the second thing. And I guess the question is do you want to move into small groups, Faith? Or do you
it's up to the group.
I mean, there's 16 of us here. Maybe we should just stick with this for right now. Because we didn't even, okay. All right, that's fine. I'm getting enough thumbs up. Okay, so here we go. So the author states, the bigger the change or reform needed, the greater the courage that will be required. In your judgment, what changes are needed in the church or in the world today that will require the most courage to accomplish, and why? I'm going to go ahead and share this. And here's the reason why I don't want to spend all our time talking about baptism and sacrament, because they are critically important, but we're missing what Martin Luther was trying to do, which is there was a change coming. There was a stand he was making. I don't want to lose that theme, because that's what this chapter was about. And so I absolutely appreciate that we need more energy on baptism and sacrament, and probably need a class on it, but I don't want to lose the theme of where we're going here. Okay, so again, Rob, the author states, the bigger the change or reform needed, the greater the courage that will be required. In your judgment, what changes are needed in the church or in the world today that will require the most courage to accomplish? What about in your personal life? And you can also look at the third question. Jesus didn't take a stand to improve his own standing, but to put others in good standing. What stands have you taken that do not benefit you but benefit others? All right. And I'll put those questions in the chat.
What's the example of Jesus didn't take a stand to improve his own standing, but to benefit others? Are you referring to the scripture, the Matthew 14, or?
So ask your question again. Sorry, I wasn't listening. Ask your question again.
Well, you just read the third, that Jesus didn't take a stand to improve his own standing, but to put others in good standing.
Yep.
Is the example of that the Matthew passage?
No.
What?
I guess that's a great question. What are the examples? Where did Jesus take a stand? It's a great question. Where did Jesus take a stand to improve, to not, where he wasn't improving his standing, he was being courageous and putting himself last and putting others first.
Yeah, it says page 74, but I read it online, so I don't have the book.
Well, what about if you thought about the incident in the temple? The cleansing of the temple was a stand against those who were exploiting.
Like the money changers, you mean?
Yes.
My thought was he went to the cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be true too.
I guess
Mike?
that's the main one, yeah.
Mike, do you have
No, the cross was where I went immediately with that.
The people he hung out with, the marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I put page 74, June, because that's just a citation. It's just where the quote was. I feel like I can't quote somebody without citing at least where it came from. So that's why I put that there. It wasn't his entire life taking stands to not improve his own standing, but to improve right. It was to improve those, calling people friends instead of his servants. That's what Shannon wrote. Yep.
Well, his entire life was just saying, if he was trying to be a member of the Jewish church, he wouldn't have done what he was doing, because he lost faith with them consistently. He was always the outsider. And in doing that, he pointed at all these people who were being condemned or, accused of being evil, bad, and said, no, they have value.
Mm-hmm.
Well, his whole Sermon on the Mount, wasn't that, that's the main the sermon that really does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are all good examples.
Yeah. So it goes back to like, where does that come into, how does it apply to us? Again, not that we're Jesus, but just what stance have you taken that don't benefit you, but benefit others? There's one that's so obvious right now. Okay, go ahead, Stephanie.
I'm probably going to say the one you're thinking of. I think the most obvious and most relevant right now is the resurgence, which it was there before, but now everybody knows about Black Lives Matter. And so that is, I think, a perfect example of where I think many of us have lived our lives, considering ourselves not racist. My whole life, I've never had racist beliefs, but have I had the courage, like taking from that question, Dana, that you brought up, the courage to take it a step further, to do what Jesus would do, which is become an activist, become anti-racist, actively working, put yourself out there and this is to benefit people. It's really to benefit everyone, including yourself, but it's really benefiting people who have been marginalized for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mom, go ahead.
I think, accepting the homosexual in the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's a stand.
Yeah, we're
that
right
in the Methodist Church, some of us are taking.
Right, we're right in the middle of it.
Right, and we're,
example.
It may be leaving the church that we knew.
Mm-hmm.
Make a stand.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, go ahead, and then Michelle.
I have a couple of thoughts on taking a stand. I'm comfortable being a Christian, and when people ask me, what's my religion, I jump right in and say I'm a Christian. I had an experience once where I was at a dergah, a Muslim group, down in the basement of a man's house. About half a dozen Muslim men were there, and they wanted to ask me questions. I said, fine, ask me anything you want. Their question was, why do you have 3 gods? You all may know about that, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Anyway, I answered all those, and I felt comfortable just saying, this is what we're doing. Now today, it's a little different. The Lord has me doing something different. I'm trying to encourage people to let every religion serve its faithful as only it can. And those religions that feel they're right and everybody else is wrong are sort of standing in my way, if you will, or I'm standing in the way or something like that. So I have to stand for that proposition. And that is a current issue that's going on right now. So I just want to mention those 2 things.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Michelle? Now you muted yourself.
Oh, sorry. You're asking for specifics. One thing I thought about was signing petitions, for things that back up our ethical beliefs. And about a week ago, and I will admit, I was a little ashamed it took me so long to think about it, was I did not realize that California does not, or until recently, I don't know how the vote went, let people on parole vote in elections. And there was a petition out by the ACLU to put before, the people that are going to vote on this in our local Congress in California. And I voted on it, or I I signed the petition. And I thought, talk about being marginalized. They're released from prison and you're not allowed to be a citizen. Some people may disagree with that, but I kind of wondered about that.
Jonathan, go ahead.
That's one of the major issues in the white privilege discussions that are going on right now. The idea that the system, if you will, the justice system, unfairly discriminates against blacks. And the killer statistic I saw was that 1 of 17 whites is in prison, but 1 of 3 blacks is in prison. That's obvious discrimination. So the problem was, once you get a conviction, they take away a lot of your rights, and it's hard to get a job, and you can't vote, and that's for the rest of your life. So this is an example, just what you're talking about, Michelle, of this systemic racism that we're dealing with. Anyway, Dana, you know what that's about, and I'm trying to learn about it. So I thought I'd make that comment.
Thank you. We're all trying to learn about, Jonathan. I appreciate that. I have to say, the one thing I thought about, it was not nearly as profound as all of your things. So I have to be honest with you. I thought the one thing that we can do right now that may not benefit us, but benefits others, is wearing our mask. Like, that's just like the most, I don't know. I was like the simple, like, that's the whole thing is like, if like some people are like, I just don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to be out. And I'm like, put the daggone mask on. Just, it's not going to hurt you, and it's going to help other people.
And it may help you.
And it may help you.
And it may help you. I mean, this notion, I'm only doing it for you. No?
Donna, go ahead.
Well, I thought Faith had it.
No.
Okay. Reading this book this week, well, every week, but particularly this week, I just kept mixing up whether I was reading White Fragility or the Reformation. I really did. I kept thinking, oh yeah, I read that there. No, right here. It's amazing. And I wondered if the 2 of you knew that when you chose this book, because I'm not reading it solely based on the Reformation at all.
This is how awesome God is.
Yeah. It's funny how it resonates with contemporary issues. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Now
We've said that several times.
Yeah.
That how did we choose this particular book for this particular time, and have gone back and said, Holy Spirit, she has her own ideas.
She does, man. She is moving. Mike, go ahead.
Well, this, to me, what I wound up with in going through this whole thing was that I found even the question about things which benefit others but not you is kind of impossible to really answer, because if you're doing things which benefit others, it almost inevitably benefits you.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And even, and I don't really understand what went on, but when Christ went to the cross, clearly it looks like it did not benefit him, but it benefited mankind. But who do we worship? So it's like, it's just kind of this.
It's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, it's one of those things I don't understand, but someday I hope I will.
Yeah, you and me both. That's super interesting.
Like,
Fascinating when you think about it.
You could say that, like when you're looking at racism. If there were no racism, who would benefit? All of us. I mean, it's not just you can say, well, that would be better for this group or that group. It would be better for all of us.
Yeah.
So dismantling the structures ultimately is something that I'm doing for myself, my children, and my grandchildren.
Right. It is a process. Well, I did have us reading Matthew 14:22-33, which is the story of Jesus walking on the water, and then Peter coming out, or Peter saying, "Call me," and then he starts to falter, and then Jesus saves him. It was one of the scriptures highlighted in the chapter, but I found this quote interesting. It was more of a global theme, and the author writes it on page 78 of the book. He says, "The hope of the church is Jesus being in the boat, not the disciples trying to act like Jesus on their own." I thought that was very thought-provoking, and just kind of curious to see what do you think about that? So and I can, the hope of Jesus, I'll copy it and paste it in the copy, paste. The hope of the church is Jesus being in the boat, not the disciples trying to act like Jesus on their own, which is, it's strange to me because I always think like, oh, I should try to act like Jesus. So I don't know.
Maybe it's a lesson that we can't do it alone. We have to do it in community. Or that is thought-provoking, though.
Yeah.
Well, the boat is the church.
Right.
And so it's easier for me to interpret it by just substituting the word. If Jesus is in the church. But I can't get any past that. That's as far as I got.
Ruth put act with Jesus. So I think that's the point, right? You're not acting like you're acting with, Jesus is with you. There's a collective approach to it. Mike, go ahead.
Walking with Jesus.
Walking with Jesus. Mike, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess I looked at it as the idea that Jesus is what makes the boat, the church, the church. The power of Jesus, of God, leading us, giving us direction, giving us insight, giving us a purpose, is what this is about. It's not us trying to follow somebody around. It's us trying to just be wholly encompassed and part of that movement, so that it comes from our souls, from our very hearts.
Yeah.
That's the way I look.
Yeah, and Paul said, Jesus said, follow me, not be me, right? So don't be me, but follow my ways. My mom said, Jesus is always with us. Like Jesus is always there, always present. And Patty said, this is very reassuring. Thank you, Patty. Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
I just want to say that this emphasizes that Jesus wants us to be not him, but be ourselves. And he came that we might have life and have it to the full. So he's encouraging us to be fully ourselves and take the responsibility for that, which includes having faith in him.
Yeah. Shannon, go ahead.
It reminds me of that Wesleyan saying where I think it's like, I am saved, I'm being saved, and I will be saved. And it's like, it's God's action, you know, not necessarily like that we have to earn it. Because I think growing up at the church, like in the 80s and 90s, I had a lot of guilt for not being a good evangelist, you know, like, or not a convincing one to like my friends, but feeling like, you know, that's God's job. You know, I try to participate, but it's not all on me. So that helps.
Well, and the quote you said, it's a process.
Yeah.
You know, and that I think is one of the gifts United Methodism gives, what they mean by sanctification, that God is continually at work in us, moving us forward. So we don't reach the point where we say, hey, God, you're done with me now, go to somebody else.
Kathy wrote, Jesus in the boat seems to prevent people striking out in the wrong directions. I like that idea. June, I agree. This is an area that I struggle with. It's hard to know the church's role in all this. The church is controversial for so many, so not trusted as an impartial arbiter. But the idea of community can take priority, connected or not to the church. So I think the idea you're saying is community can create us as connected with or without the church. The church is controversial for me too. Because sometimes I mean, it's funny. I mean, we're studying Martin Luther and the Reformation, and he was not happy with the church. And so now he creates a new church. So this is what I'm trying to, like, what is the church?
He didn't intend to create a new church.
Really?
And no, he did not. Jesus didn't intend, in a sense. He was trying to reform Judaism. Martin Luther was trying to reform Catholicism. John Wesley was trying to reform.
So it's interesting.
The Anglican Church, I mean, they weren't trying to create new denominations. And now we have people today who are trying to reform the United Methodist Church.
So that would tell me, all that data you've given me is showing me that reform does not work. Because everybody's trying to reform, and reform is not working. So here, and the interesting reason is because I just researched this, and reform is really about reshaping, changing, but at the end of the day, it still is the system still exists the way it is, and so really you have to abolish it.
Well, you have to practice resurrection, which is not reformation.
Who's waiting? I got Mike. Barbara, are you waving at me too? Let me go to Barbara and then I'll go to Mike. Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh. Well, I am still at that question from before. Why did Luther, or how did he want to abolish the 7 sacraments, or what does that mean for us, or whatever?
I think he was, again, I don't know if it was so much abolish the 7 sacraments, but abolish the way they were being used to hold people captive. Okay, I think it was more of that. That his quarrel wasn't with them per se, but they were a way that the Roman Catholic Church was saying, I don't give you the sacraments. I won't baptize you. They could put a whole country under interdict and nobody could have the sacraments. No priest could give a sacrament. Those people were literally doomed by the theology of the time.
Right. It was control. It was like, if you don't get this, guess what? You're going to hell and you're dying.
Luther was objecting to that.
I love it. I love it.
More so the practice than the essence of the sacraments, I think.
Yeah. Wait, hold on, Barbara. You're muted. It's not unmuting. Can you unmute yourself? All right. I don't know. I'm trying to unmute it. It's not working. I think you have to, there you go. Go.
And I'm done. I mean, I was done after that.
Okay. All right. Mike, go ahead.
Well, no, now I've lost the question that we had before.
So what I think you were responding to was the fact that I was saying data is now showing us reform doesn't work.
Oh, yes. And my contention is that reform is all we can ever continuously do. We have to keep changing because we haven't found God yet. I mean, we're still out there in search, desperately looking for him, and he's there helping us every way he can, but it's a growing process. So I think we're doomed to being reformed and reformed over and over again.
We're doomed to be reformed?
Uh-huh.
That's awesome.
It's like that joke where God sends all these messages via the flood and everything else, and you don't get it. You don't get it yet.
Stephanie, do you have something?
I was just going to say also the church is, so much a human construct. And I think that's why, like Dana, you were saying you struggle with the church. I struggle with the church. I struggle getting, encouraging people to go to church, and it's that human element. And so we try to reform. And when we think of like the United Methodist Church, we try to reform, but not everybody's on board. Not everyone has the same thoughts. And like going to our CalPAC annual conference, like I remember the first time I went and it was one of the most amazing experiences. And I felt so in alignment with everyone there. But then we have the general conference and it's like it's a different church or a different, all the negativity and the things that happen there. So it's not everybody's, we're human and super imperfect, and not everybody's walking the same path when it comes to the church.
I guess my dad wrote, reform leads to revolution. And I think if reform leads to revolution, then revolution leads to abolition. Complete elimination. Don't give me, anyway, okay, wait, where were we? Sorry. I got that. I'm reading some comments here. Dana, what does work? Abolition. June, maybe truth and reconciliation can work. I read today that 3 cities, San Francisco, Boston, and Philly, are going to launch a truth and reconciliation process similar to what South Africa did. Is that restorative justice? I think it's similar to restorative justice. Yeah, we need Desmond Tutu. Yeah. All right, it's 11 o'clock, so I want to be sensitive to that. So if you do need to part ways with us, go in peace. If you want, we will stay on for a little bit longer and continue to entertain questions and thoughts on this and I will leave you with, where do you stand? That's the last thing that the author writes in the chapter is, where do you stand? I would actually say, where do you stand where it is uncomfortable? Because I think it's easy for us to make stands where it's comfortable. Where is it uncomfortable? Where is it uncomfortable for you? For me, I think that's the question I ask myself.
I think, one of the things today that some of us struggle with is we have to shut up and listen. And that taking a stand can be simply that I allow other voices that I don't want to hear to tell me what I don't want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Amen.
And that's hard because we have the answers. and we have a vision of what might be, and we have all of this, and sometimes taking a stand is deciding that for now I listen instead of trying to solve the problem.
Well, I think our problems are hard to solve right now. Jonathan, go ahead.
I'd like to talk about evangelism for a moment. I've struggled with what do I do about evangelism as a Christian. And I've come to this conclusion. I've seen people and been in churches where the pastors would actually count one's souls. And every time they'd have somebody come up to the altar and they'd give their life to Christ, the pastor would count a soul that he had won. And his effort was to go out and get more and more souls that he could win. To me, that's not evangelism. I've seen people practice it that way. But to me, evangelism is not forcing people to convert to my way, but to provide an example of being a good Christian. And if they like that, maybe they'll say, hey, how'd you get there? And then you can give them your talk and your message. And that's evangelism to me. And I think it's important to understand the difference. Just like the old church, you're not trying to force everybody. Luther said, no, do this on faith. And I think that's what we need to do with our evangelism.